The morning of October 14th, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer stood in the dispersal hut at Wiesbaden-Erbenheim airfield, watching through rain-streaked windows as ground crews prepared his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 for another intercept mission. The American bombers were coming again. They always came. Fischer had flown 73 combat missions over 2 years. He had shot down 11 Allied aircraft. He knew the sound of every weapon in the sky over the Reich, the sharp crack of 20mm cannons, the distinctive buzz of his own 13mm MG-131 machine guns, the heavier thump of 30mm shells tearing through aluminum and flesh. But there was another sound he had learned to recognize, a sound that made even veteran pilots like him grip their controls a little tighter. The deep, rhythmic thunder of American 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 13 of them on every B-17, flying fortress, hundreds of bombers in every raid, thousands of guns, all firing the same massive half-inch cartridge that could reach out nearly 2,000 meters with lethal effect. Fischer's wingman, a young pilot named Werner Dietrich on only his 8th mission, asked the question that hung in the air between them. "Herr Oberleutnant, is it true what they say about the American 50 caliber, that it's better than our 13mm? Fischer didn't answer immediately. He lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. The question was dangerous, not because asking it would bring punishment, but because answering it honestly meant admitting something that contradicted everything the Luftwaffe High Command had told them. That German engineering, German precision, German superiority in all things military might not be absolute. Finally, he spoke. You'll find out for yourself today. Just remember, don't fixate on the tracers. For every one you see, there are 4. More rounds you cannot see. The scramble order came 30 minutes later. American heavy bombers approaching from the west. Altitude 7,000 meters. Course bearing 090. All available fighters to intercept. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Fischer and his staffel climbed through broken clouds into brilliant sunshine. At 6,000 meters, they spotted them. A formation of B-17 bombers, flying in their distinctive combat box pattern. Each box contained 18 to 21 aircraft, arranged in 3-dimensional space to maximize overlapping fields of defensive fire. The Americans had learned this tactic through bitter experience. It worked. Fischer keyed his radio. Attack from 12 o'clock high. Diving pass. Do not linger in their fire zone. Acknowledge. The responses crackled back. His pilots knew the drill. They had done this before. Some of them would not do it again. Fischer rolled his Bf 109 into the attack. The world inverted. Sky became ground, ground became sky. His airspeed indicator climbed past 500 kilometers per hour. The bombers grew larger in his gun sight. He could see the plexiglass nose turrets, the waist gunners, the ball turret hanging beneath each fuselage like a grotesque metal egg. Then they opened fire. The Americans didn't wait for German fighters to close within cannon range. They opened fire at 800 meters, perhaps 900, distances at which most machine guns were merely making noise and wasting ammunition. But the 50 caliber Browning wasn't most machine guns. Fischer saw the tracers first, streams of them, 1 round in every 5 glowing orange-red as it arced toward him. His mind performed the automatic calculation that every Luftwaffe pilot learned to make. If he could see 50 tracers, there were 200 additional rounds he couldn't see, all following the same trajectory, all arriving at the same point in space and time. The sound followed a split second later, not the sharp crack of rifle-caliber weapons, not even the heavier bark of German 13mm guns. This was something else entirely, a deep bass drumbeat, methodical, relentless, the sound of massive projectiles moving through air at supersonic speed, each one carrying enough kinetic energy to tear through aluminum, steel, and human flesh, as if they were paper. Fischer's fighter shuddered. He felt the impacts rather than heard them. 3 rounds struck his aircraft in less than 2 seconds. One punched through his left wing, leaving a hole the size of a man's fist. Another struck his engine cowling, ricocheting off the armoured housing that protected his Daimler-Benz 601 engine. The third hit his canopy frame, starred the plexiglass beside his head, and filled his cockpit with a spray of metal fragments. He fired his weapons. 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns mounted in the engine cowling, 2 20mm MG-151 cannons in the wing roots. The combined rate of fire sent 60 rounds per second toward the nearest B-17. He saw his tracer rounds converge on the bomber's fuselage, saw the impact sparkle along the metal skin, saw exactly nothing happen. The B-17 flew on, undamaged, still firing. Fischer dove away, his heart hammering. His airspeed climbed past 650 kilometers per hour. He pulled out of the dive at 4,000 meters, his vision greying at the edges from the G-forces. When his sight cleared, he looked back. Werner Dietrich's fighter was spinning toward the earth, trailing black smoke. The young pilot who had asked about the American 50 caliber would never need the answer now. His fighter had been hit in the fuel tank. The self-sealing mechanism had failed, or perhaps been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of fire. Now he was falling, and Fischer could do nothing but watch. 2 more German fighters fell from the sky in the next 5 minutes. One simply exploded, its ammunition stores detonating under sustained 50 caliber fire. The other lost its tail section when a burst from a ball turret gunner stitched across the empennage at a shallow angle, the heavy rounds cutting through the aluminum structure like a saw through wood. The American formation flew on. Some bombers showed damage. A few trailed smoke, but they kept flying, kept firing, kept moving toward their target with the inexorable momentum of a glacier. The Germans had lost 4 fighters, destroying 1 bomber. The mathematics of attrition were not in their favour. Back at Wiesbaden-Erbenheim, Fischer climbed from his cockpit on legs that trembled despite his best efforts to control them. His crew chief, a Feldwebel named Hans Müller, who had been maintaining fighters since 1939, walked around the aircraft with a clipboard, documenting the damage. 3 hits, he reported. 1 wing, 1 engine cowling, 1 canopy frame. You were lucky, Herr Oberleutnant. I've seen 50 caliber rounds go completely through a fighter's fuselage, in one side, out the other, taking everything in between with them. Fischer nodded. He had seen it too. He pulled off his flying gloves and lit another cigarette. His hands were steadier now, but the images remained. The tracers. The sound. The casual, almost contemptuous ease with which American gunners had engaged his attack at ranges where German weapons were barely effective. "How long until we get something better?" he asked. "Something that can match their 50 caliber?" Müller shrugged. He was too old and too experienced to believe in promises anymore. The 13mm is lighter, faster firing. The high explosive rounds are supposed to make up for the smaller projectile size. "Supposed to," Fischer repeated. He let the words hang in the air. They both knew the truth. The MG-131 was an excellent weapon by any standard except one. It had to fight against the American Browning M2, and in that comparison, excellent wasn't good enough. The real problem, Fischer thought but did not say aloud, was that the Americans didn't need technological sophistication. They had solved the bomber defense problem through brute force, more guns, more ammunition, more training, more aircraft. The 50 caliber wasn't the most advanced heavy machine gun in the world. It was simply the most effective, because effectiveness in war is measured not by elegance but by results. That night, in the officers' mess, Fischer sat with the surviving pilots of his staffel. They drank schnapps and tried not to think about the empty chairs. Werner Dietrich's belongings would be packed tomorrow. His family in Mannheim would receive the notification. Died in aerial combat over the Reich, serving with honour until the end. Died in aerial, wanted to voice. Why don't we have captured American 50 calibers? We must have recovered some from downed bombers. Why can't we mount them on our own aircraft? An older pilot, a major who had flown in Spain before the war, answered, "We have captured them. Technical branch has been examining them since 1942. Do you know what they found? The weapon is simple, reliable, easy to manufacture. It uses an ammunition cartridge that delivers nearly twice the kinetic energy of our 13mm round, and it functions perfectly in conditions that would jam our guns." "Then why?" someone asked. "Because," the major said slowly, "to adopt it would be to admit that American engineering is superior to German engineering, and that admission would contradict everything we've been told about racial superiority, about German technical prowess, about the inevitable triumph of our weapons over those of the mongrel nations. So instead, we continue using the 13mm. Ourselves that its higher rate of fire and explosive ammunition compensate for its lower muzzle energy. We lose pilots, and the Americans keep flying." The room fell silent. Outside, air raid sirens began to wail. The British were coming now, with their night bombers. The war continued, indifferent to doctrine, to pride, to the hopes and fears of the men who fought it. Fischer finished his schnapps and stood. He had an early morning mission. The Americans would come again tomorrow, as they had come today, as they would come every day until the war ended. And every day he would fly against them, knowing that the sound he feared most was the sound of 50 caliber guns that his side could have matched but chose not to, for reasons that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with ideology. The story of how Germany encountered the American 50 caliber Browning and eventually had to confront its superiority over their own 13mm MG 131 is not a story of a single dramatic test or admission. It is a story that unfolded across years of combat, in scattered fragments of experience, in conversations that officers had to be careful about, in after-action reports that were read and filed and quietly ignored. But it began, in many ways, not in the skies over Germany, but years earlier, in the design bureaus and testing ranges where both weapons were created. The differences between the American 50 caliber and the German 13mm were not accidents. They were the results of fundamentally different philosophies about what a heavy machine gun should be, what it should do, and what compromises were acceptable in its design. To understand why German pilots feared the American weapon, and why German engineers eventually had to acknowledge its superiority, we must go back to the beginning, to the men who designed these weapons, and the assumptions they made about modern warfare. The Browning 50 caliber machine gun was born from a request made in 1917 by General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force in France. Pershing had seen the future of warfare: armored vehicles, fortified positions, aircraft. The standard rifle caliber machine guns of the First World War, firing 7.62mm or 8mm rounds, were becoming inadequate. What was needed was a weapon that could penetrate light armor, destroy equipment at long range, and provide effective anti-aircraft fire. John Moses Browning, already famous for his machine gun designs, took on the challenge. He scaled up his existing M1917 30 caliber machine gun to chamber a new, much larger cartridge. Winchester developed the ammunition, the 50 BMG, for Browning machine gun, a 12.7mm cartridge that fired a projectile weighing between 660 and 750 grains at velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. The mathematics were impressive. Muzzle energy ranged from 12,000 to 15,000 foot-pounds, depending on the specific loading. This was not merely twice the energy of a rifle cartridge, it was 5 to 7 times greater. A 50 BMG round could penetrate 19 millimeters of armor steel at 500 meters. It could punch through concrete walls. It could tear through aircraft structures and continue through the other side with enough residual energy to remain lethal. But raw power was only part of the equation. Browning designed the weapon for reliability above all else. The operating mechanism was simple: short recoil, with a vertically moving breech block locked by a rising bolt face. There were no complex parts, no fragile components, no mechanisms that required precise tolerances to function. The weapon was designed to work in conditions that would stop more sophisticated guns. Dust, mud, extreme cold, extreme heat. The first production version, the M1921, was water-cooled and weighed 55 kilograms, too heavy for mobile warfare. In 1933, the military adopted the M2HB, the heavy barrel version, air-cooled, weighing 38 kilograms without the tripod. Still heavy, but manageable for a crew-served weapon. The heavy barrel could sustain fire without overheating. The weapon could fire continuously for hours if properly maintained. The American philosophy was straightforward. Build a weapon that works, every time, in every condition. Accept the weight penalty. Accept the lower rate of fire compared to lighter weapons. Prioritize reliability and hitting power over sophistication. The German approach was different. In 1938, Rheinmetall Borsig began development of the MG-131. The Luftwaffe had identified a problem. Increasing armor protection on Allied aircraft was making the standard 7.92mm MG-17 machine gun obsolete. Something heavier was needed, but it had to fit in the same mounting points as the MG-17, particularly in the cramped engine cowlings of fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109. The solution was elegant from an engineering standpoint. Design a 13mm weapon that was as small and light as possible. The MG-131 weighed only 16.6 kilograms, less than half the weight of the American M2. It achieved a rate of fire of 900 rounds per minute, nearly twice that of the Browning. It used electrically primed ammunition, allowing it to fire through propeller synchronization mechanisms without reliability issues. The ammunition was sophisticated. The 13 by 64mm B cartridge fired projectiles that included armor-piercing, incendiary, high-explosive incendiary, and tracer variants. The high-explosive rounds contained 1.4 grams of PTN explosive. Not much, but enough to cause damage beyond simple kinetic impact. On paper, the MG-131 looked excellent, lighter than the American weapon, meaning more could be carried. Faster firing, meaning more rounds downrange per second. Explosive ammunition, meaning each hit could be more destructive than a solid projectile of the same size. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems. Problems that would become apparent only in combat, when theory met reality and ideology met physics. The 13mm cartridge generated approximately 9,560 joules of muzzle energy, roughly 7,050 foot-pounds. This was less than 60% of the energy produced by the 50 BMG cartridge. The projectile weighed 34 to 38 grams, compared to 43 to 48 grams for the American round. It travelled at 750 meters per second, compared to 880 meters per second for the 50 BMG. These numbers might seem abstract, but in aerial combat, they translated into concrete differences. The 50 caliber could engage effectively at 1800 meters. The 13mm was optimized for shorter ranges. The 50 caliber projectile retained lethal energy at long range. The 13mm lost velocity more quickly. Most critically, the 50 caliber round had 75% more kinetic energy. When it hit a structural member, an engine mount, a wing spar, a fuel tank, it didn't just penetrate, it destroyed. The massive transfer of kinetic energy caused secondary damage far beyond the wound channel. Fuel tanks split at the seams, spars fractured, hydraulic lines ruptured along their entire length. The German high-explosive ammunition was supposed to compensate for this, but British testing captured during the war revealed a fatal flaw. The fuses were too sensitive. They detonated on contact with thin aluminum skin, exploding before the round could penetrate into the aircraft's interior to damage critical components. A 13mm HE round might blow a hole in a wing, but a 50 caliber solid projectile would penetrate through the wing and destroy the fuel tank behind it. None of this was immediately obvious in 1940, when the MG-131 entered service. German pilots were pleased with the weapon. It was better than the 7.92mm guns it replaced. It gave them a fighting chance against armoured Allied aircraft. But then they encountered the American heavy bombers with their 50-caliber defensive armament, and everything changed. The Americans had created something the Germans hadn't anticipated. They had built an entire aerial combat doctrine around the 50 caliber. Every B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 Browning M2s. Every B-24 Liberator carried 10. A typical formation of 36 bombers meant over 400 heavy machine guns, all firing the same ammunition, all supplied from American industry that produced billions of rounds. The combined defensive firepower of a bomber formation exceeded 6,000 rounds per minute. German fighters attacking from any angle faced overlapping fields of fire. If you attacked from ahead, the nose guns and top turret engaged. From behind, the tail guns and ball turret. From the sides, the waist guns. From above or below, the ball and top turrets. There was no safe approach. And the weapons never jammed. This was perhaps the most demoralizing aspect for German pilots. Their own guns, whether rifle caliber or the 13mm, were prone to stoppages, especially in the cold air at high altitude. Ammunition feeds froze. Mechanisms seized. Pilots would press their firing buttons and get nothing, or get a few rounds before the weapons stopped. The American 50 calibers just kept firing. Hour after hour, raid after raid, in temperatures 40 degrees below zero, after being hit by German cannon fire after extended combat. They worked. German technical intelligence knew all of this. Starting in 1942, they had access to captured 50 caliber weapons and ammunition recovered from downed American aircraft. These weapons were sent to testing facilities at Kummersdorf, Rechlin, and other locations. Engineers disassembled them, examined them, test-fired them, analysed the ammunition. The reports that came back were uncomfortable reading for men who believed in German technical superiority. The weapon functioned flawlessly. The ammunition showed consistent quality across thousands of rounds tested. The ballistic performance matched or exceeded specifications. Most significantly, the simplicity of the design meant it could be manufactured quickly and in enormous quantities. American factories were producing these weapons at rates German industry couldn't match even with simpler designs. One report, dated March 19, 1943, from the Luftwaffe Technical Testing Center at Rechlin, was particularly blunt in its assessment. The engineering team had test-fired a captured M2 Browning for over 10,000 rounds in various conditions. The summary was devastating in its honesty. The American 50 caliber machine gun represents a fundamentally different approach to weapons design than our own, where we have pursued lightness, rate of fire, and ammunition sophistication. The Americans have pursued reliability, hitting power, and ease of manufacture. In sustained firing tests, the weapon functioned without malfunction across temperature ranges from -40 degrees Celsius to +40 degrees Celsius. Barrel changes can be accomplished by moderately trained crew in under 2 minutes. The weapon's recoil-operated mechanism is robust and tolerant of manufacturing variations that would cause failure in more precisely engineered systems. Ballistically, the 50 BMG cartridge delivers approximately 75% more kinetic energy than our 13 by 64mm cartridge. This energy advantage translates into superior performance against structural targets, fuel systems, and armored components. While our high-explosive ammunition provides enhanced damage potential per hit, the increased probability of critical damage from the American solid projectile often negates this advantage in practical terms. Most significantly, captured ammunition stocks show remarkable consistency in quality and performance. This suggests American manufacturing capacity and quality control procedures that exceed our own in several key areas. The report concluded with a recommendation that was never implemented. Consider development of a German equivalent to the 50 BMG cartridge and associated weapon system for adoption in future aircraft designs. The recommendation was filed and forgotten, not because it was technically unsound, but because by 1943, Germany was fighting a defensive war. Resources were stretched. Production was focused on existing designs, retooling for a new heavy machine. Gun cartridge would require ammunition factories to modify their production lines. Aircraft designers would need to strengthen mounting points. Logistics would become more complicated. And there was another factor, one that never appeared in official documents but that everyone understood. To adopt an American cartridge design would be to publicly acknowledge that American engineering had produced something superior to German engineering. For a regime built on assertions of racial and technical superiority, this was ideologically unacceptable. So the Luftwaffe continued using the MG-131, and pilots like Klaus Fischer continued flying against American bombers, knowing that every mission meant facing weapons their own aircraft couldn't match. The encounters multiplied. Every major raid brought new stories, new experiences, new evidence of the .50 caliber's effectiveness. May 17, 1943. Hauptmann Walter Dahl, flying a Focke-Wulf 190, equipped with 4 MG-151 20mm cannons and 2 MG-131 13mm machine guns, attacked a formation of B-17s over the North Sea. He approached from 6 o'clock high, using the sun to mask his approach. He opened fire at 400 meters with his cannons. His shells struck the bomber's right wing and fuselage. He saw the impacts, saw the damage. But before he could assess the effect, the bomber's defensive fire found him. The tail gunner, the ball turret, and the right waist gun all engaged simultaneously. Dahl felt his aircraft shudder under multiple impacts. A .50 caliber round struck his right wing, punching through the aluminum skin and exiting through the top surface. Another round hit his engine cowling and ricocheted into his propeller, chipping one blade. A third round, and this was the one that would haunt him for years, struck his canopy frame inches from his head, sending plexiglass fragments into his face and temporarily blinding his right eye. He broke off the attack and dove away, blood streaming from a dozen small cuts across his face and neck. The bomber he had attacked, despite taking 20mm cannon hits, continued flying in formation. Later analysis would show that his cannon shells had penetrated the bomber's skin but had not hit any critical systems. The B-17's redundant design, with 4 engines, multiple fuel tanks, and structural strength that exceeded any German bomber, allowed it to absorb damage that would have destroyed a Luftwaffe aircraft. Dahl returned to base with vision blurred, his fighter damaged, having expended most of his ammunition without achieving a kill. He spent 2 weeks in hospital while his eye healed. When he returned to his squadron, his crew chief showed him the recovered fragments from his aircraft. .50 caliber, Muller said, holding up a deformed projectile. We found 11 impact points, 3 complete penetrations, 8 rounds that struck and deflected. You were lucky it wasn't a direct hit. A .50 caliber through the cockpit doesn't leave survivors. July 28, 1943. Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Marseille, no relation to the more famous ace Hans-Joachim Marseille, who had died the previous year, was flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 over Kassel when he encountered what intelligence had identified as a straggler, a damaged B-17 that had fallen behind its formation. Stragglers were considered easy targets. Without the overlapping defensive fire of the formation, a single bomber should be vulnerable. Marseille attacked from below and behind, where the ball turret had limited traverse. He closed to 300 meters before opening fire with his 13mm guns and 20mm cannon. He saw his rounds strike the bomber's fuselage and wing roots. He was concentrating on his gun sight, lining up for a second burst, when the ball turret rotated and opened fire. The .50 caliber rounds walked up his fuselage from tail to cockpit in less than 2 seconds. The first 3 rounds struck his empennage, tearing away sections of his elevator. The next 5 struck along the fuselage spine, penetrating the thin aluminum and destroying the radio equipment, oxygen system, and fuel transfer pump. The final rounds struck his engine cowling, and one penetrated the armoured housing to strike the engine block itself. Glycol coolant sprayed across his windscreen. His engine seized immediately. Temperature gauges spiked into the red. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the engine caught fire. Marseille rolled inverted and dove, building speed for the bailout. At 2,000 meters, with the engine now trailing thick black smoke, he jettisoned his canopy and rolled the aircraft, letting gravity pull him clear. His parachute opened at 1,500 meters. He landed in a field outside Kassel, bruised but alive. The B-17 continued flying. Later, reports confirmed it reached England and made an emergency landing with 2 engines out and extensive damage. The crew survived. Marseille's fighter was never recovered. It crashed in a forest and burned. August 17, 1943. The double raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. 230 B-17s attacking ball-bearing factories deep inside Germany. The Luftwaffe threw everything available at them. Over 300 fighters engaged the American formations in running battles that lasted for hours. The Americans lost 60 bombers that day, but German fighter losses were catastrophic. 36 fighters shot down, another 24 damaged beyond repair. Nearly 100 pilots killed, wounded, or missing. The mathematics were clear. Germany was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be trained. The Americans were losing aircraft they could replace within weeks. After the raid, German fighter units submitted after-action reports. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Pilots described approaching the bomber formations and being met with overwhelming defensive fire at ranges where their own weapons were barely effective. They described watching 13mm rounds spark off bomber fuselages without apparent effect, while 50 caliber return fire tore through their own aircraft structures. One report, from an unnamed Oberfeldwebel with 32 kills, was particularly stark. We attack with superior tactics, superior training, and superior determination. We score hits. We see our rounds impact the enemy aircraft, and they continue flying. Then their gunners, most of whom are not professional soldiers but conscripts and volunteers with only basic training, open fire at ranges we cannot match. Their weapons do not jam. Their ammunition does not fail, and our aircraft disintegrate under their fire. I do not question German courage or skill. I question whether we are equipped to win a battle where the enemy's basic defensive weapon is superior to our primary offensive armament. The report was noted and filed. No action was taken. By late 1943, the pattern was established. Every major raid brought the same results. American bombers would penetrate German airspace. Luftwaffe fighters would attack with skill and bravery. Some bombers would be shot down, usually at great cost in German fighters. The survivors would continue to their targets, drop their bombs, and return to England. And German pilots would return to base, those who survived, with new stories about the American 50 caliber. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The problem wasn't just the weapon itself. It was the entire system the Americans had built around it. The 50 caliber was ubiquitous in American forces. It was mounted on every bomber, every fighter that could carry it, every vehicle, every position that needed heavy firepower. American industry produced not just thousands of weapons, but billions of rounds of ammunition. Quality control was rigorous. Logistics were efficient. Supply never faltered. The MG-131, by contrast, was primarily an aircraft weapon. It was used in fighters and bombers, but it never achieved the universal adoption of the American 50 caliber. Ammunition production was constrained by Germany's increasingly strained industrial capacity. By 1944, German ammunition factories were being bombed regularly by the very aircraft whose defensive armament they could not match. German engineers understood the problem. Some of them even understood the solution. But understanding and implementing are different things. And in wartime, with resources limited and priorities shifting, the gap between what should be done and what can be done often becomes unbridgeable. In early 1944, a small group of Luftwaffe officers and civilian engineers met at the Air Ministry in Berlin to discuss fighter armament. Among those present was Oberst Adolf Galland, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces and a respected voice on tactical matters. The discussion turned to the American defensive armament. Galland was characteristically blunt. He had flown against American bombers. He knew what their 50 calibers could do. When asked what the Luftwaffe needed to turn the air war around, his response was both serious and tinged with dark humour. "A squadron of Spitfires," he said, referencing the British fighter that German pilots respected and feared. "But if I cannot have Spitfires, then I would take a squadron equipped with American 50 calibers in place of our 13mm. The comment was meant partly as a joke, partly as a pointed criticism of German aerial doctrine. But the underlying truth was undeniable. The Americans had built a better heavy machine gun, and that weapon had become a cornerstone of their age. Aerial dominance. An engineer from Rheinmetall, the manufacturer of the MG-131, pushed back. "Our 13mm has advantages. Rate of fire, weight, high explosive ammunition. These are not insignificant." Galland's response was cold. "I do not care about advantages on paper. I care about pilots who come back alive. The American weapon keeps firing when ours jam. The American ammunition delivers consistent performance when ours shows increasing quality problems. The American projectile destroys what it hits. These are the only advantages that matter in combat." "Could we not manufacture the American cartridge ourselves?" someone asked. "Use captured weapons as a basis for domestic production?" "Technically, yes," the Rheinmetall engineer admitted. "We have extensively examined captured specimens. The cartridge design is straightforward. The weapon is simple to manufacture, but retooling would require months, possibly years. We would need new production lines, new quality, and control procedures. Aircraft would need reinforced mounting points for the heavier weapon. The ammunition is incompatible with our existing stocks, so logistics become more complicated. And there was the ideological issue, unspoken but understood by everyone in the room. Adopting an American design would be an admission of inferiority. For a regime that based its legitimacy on assertions of German superiority in all things, such an admission was politically impossible. The meeting concluded without resolution. The Luftwaffe would continue using the MG-131. Pilots would continue to face American 50 calibers with weapons that, while excellent by most standards, were simply not good enough for the mission they were being asked to perform. The human cost mounted through 1944. Klaus Fischer, the pilot we met at the beginning of this story, flew his 142nd and final mission on November 2nd, 1944. His squadron was vectored to intercept a formation of B-17s over Frankfurt. Fischer led his flight into a head-on attack. At 600 meters, his fighter was hit by defensive fire from multiple bombers. 50 caliber rounds struck his engine, cockpit, and left wing in quick succession. Witnesses reported seeing his fighter nose over into a steep dive, trailing fire. It impacted in a forest south of the city. Fischer's body was never recovered. He was 26 years old. His crew chief, Hans Müller, who had maintained Fischer's aircraft for over 2 years, was asked years later what he remembered most about the war. His answer was simple: the sound. That deep, rhythmic sound of the American 50 calibers. Every mechanic on the flight line knew it. We could tell when our fighters were attacking the bombers by the sound of the defensive fire. That sound meant someone wasn't coming back. Every time I heard it, I would count the minutes until our fighters returned, and count the empty revetments afterward. By the end of 1944, the strategic situation made questions of individual weapon superiority almost moot. Germany was losing the war. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, ammunition, and pilots. American bombers roamed the skies with increasing impunity, their 50 caliber defensive armament still serving faithfully, still protecting the crews who operated them. But for individual German pilots and ground crew who had seen what the American weapon could do, who had examined the damage it caused, who had lost friends and comrades to its unrelenting fire, the question remained: why hadn't Germany matched it? Why had they continued using a weapon they knew was inferior? The answer? like most answers in history, was complicated. Technical factors played a role, resources were limited, retooling was expensive, but ideology mattered too. Pride mattered. The unwillingness to acknowledge that the enemy might have done something better mattered. And so German airmen continued, flying against American bombers, knowing they were outgunned, knowing that every mission meant facing weapons their own aircraft couldn't match, knowing that the very people making decisions about their equipment would never admit the truth that every combat pilot understood. The 50 caliber Browning wasn't the reason Germany lost the war. Wars are not decided by individual weapons, but it was emblematic of a larger truth. The Americans had built a military-industrial system that prioritized practical effectiveness over theoretical sophistication. They had created weapons that worked, every time, in every condition, and they had produced them in such quantities that their enemies were overwhelmed, not by tactical brilliance, but by material reality. The MG-131 was an excellent weapon. By any objective standard other than comparison to the 50 caliber, it was a success. But wars are not fought by objective standards. They are fought by frightened young men in hostile skies, and those men judge weapons by a simple criterion: does it keep me alive, and does it kill the enemy? By that standard, the American 50 caliber was supreme, and the Germans knew it, even if they could never say so officially. The testing facility at Kummersdorf, 40 kilometers south of Berlin, had been a center of German weapons development since the 1920s. In a low brick building with reinforced walls and soundproofing, surrounded by firing ranges and ballistic laboratories, German engineers conducted the work that official doctrine preferred to ignore. March 9, 1944. Oberleutnant Heinrich Schreiber, a technical liaison officer from the Luftwaffe's Weapons Procurement Office, stood in the cold morning air, watching a team prepare for a comparative firing test. Two weapons were mounted side by side on heavy test stands. On the left, a captured American Browning M250 caliber machine gun, recovered from a B-17 that had crashed near Aachen the previous month. On the right, a standard production MG 131 13mm machine gun, fresh from the Rheinmetall factory. Behind the weapons, at intervals of 100 meters, 200 meters, and 300 meters, stood identical targets. Sections of aluminum aircraft skin backed by wooden frames representing typical bomber structural components. Behind those, at carefully measured distances, were fuel tank simulators, metal containers filled with water and fitted with pressure sensors to measure the hydraulic shock of projectile impacts. Schreiber had not wanted this assignment. He was an engineer, not a politician, and he understood that the results of this test would be problematic regardless of outcome. If the American weapon proved superior, he would have to write a report that contradicted official assertions of German technical supremacy. If the German weapon proved superior, no one would believe the test was fair, and the Americans' demonstrated combat effectiveness would be attributed to other factors. But the test had been ordered by someone high enough in the command structure that refusal was not an option. So here he was, clipboard in hand, watching as technicians loaded ammunition belts into both weapons. The American weapon received a belt of standard M2 ball ammunition, 660 grain projectiles, muzzle velocity approximately 2,850 feet per second. The German weapon received a mixed belt typical of combat loading, half armor-piercing tracer rounds, half high-explosive incendiary tracer rounds, standard combat mix. Fire the 13mm first, Schreiber ordered. The gunner, a Feldwebel named Ernst Koch, who had been testing weapons at Kummersdorf for 6 years, settled behind the MG-131 and pressed the firing button. The weapon hammered out a burst of 20 rounds in 1.3 seconds. The rate of fire was impressive, 900 rounds per minute, a rapid staccato that sounded aggressive and lethal. Downrange, the impacts were visible. The armor-piercing rounds punched clean holes through the aluminum target at 100 meters. The high-explosive rounds detonated on contact, blowing fist-sized craters in the metal. At 200 meters, the pattern was similar, but the craters were smaller. At 300 meters, several rounds penetrated, but the explosive rounds were detonating prematurely on the aluminum skin, rather than penetrating deep enough to reach critical components behind it. The fuel tank simulators told a more complex story. At 100 meters, the armor-piercing rounds penetrated cleanly, creating entry and exit holes. The pressure sensors registered relatively modest spikes. The projectiles were passing through without imparting significant hydraulic shock. The high explosive rounds that hit the tanks detonated on the outer surface, denting the metal but not penetrating. The fuse sensitivity problem that British testing had identified was clearly visible. Schreiber made careful notes. The MG-131 was performing exactly as expected. Against thin aluminum, the high explosive rounds created impressive-looking damage. But against the layered structure of an actual bomber skin, then frames, then systems, then more skin, the fuse sensitivity was causing the rounds to expend their energy too early. "Now, the American weapon," he said. Koch moved to the M2 Browning. He had test-fired captured American weapons before and had developed a grudging respect for them. The weapon was heavier, bulkier, less elegant than German designs. But it had one quality that German weapons often lacked. It was absolutely reliable. In thousands of test rounds, across multiple captured weapons, the stoppage rate had been effectively zero. He pressed the trigger. The M2 fired at its characteristic rate of 500 rounds per minute, nearly half the rate of the MG-131. But the sound was different, deeper, more authoritative. Each round was a distinct thump of displaced air rather than the rapid chatter of the German weapon. The downrange effects were immediate and dramatic. At 100 meters, the 50 caliber rounds didn't just penetrate the aluminum target, they tore ragged holes the size of a man's fist. The structural frames behind the aluminum were visibly damaged, bent and cracked by the massive kinetic energy transfer. At 200 meters, the effect was only slightly diminished. At 300 meters, the penetration was still complete, and the structural damage was still significant. The fuel tank simulators told an even more striking story. The 50 caliber rounds penetrated both the front and back walls of the tanks, creating through-and-through holes. But more significantly, the pressure sensors registered massive spikes. The hydraulic shock from the projectile's passage through the liquid was sufficient to split seams and buckle metal. Two of the three tanks at 100 meters actually ruptured along their welds, spilling their contents. This was the effect that German pilots had described in their combat reports. A single 50 caliber hit to a fuel tank often resulted in catastrophic failure, even if the projectile itself didn't ignite the fuel. The sheer kinetic energy was enough to destroy the tank's structural integrity. Koch stepped back from the weapon and turned to Schreiber. "Sir, I must note for the record that the American weapon delivered approximately 70% fewer rounds in the same firing period, but achieved visibly greater damage at all ranges tested." Schreiber nodded slowly. He was already composing the report in his mind, already trying to find language that would convey the truth without making it sound like a complete repudiation of German weapons design. "Continue the test," he said. "Maximum range engagement." The targets were repositioned at 500 meters, then 700 meters, then 1,000 meters. At each range, both weapons were fired in controlled bursts. The pattern remained consistent. The MG-131, with its lighter projectile and lower muzzle velocity, lost effectiveness rapidly with range. By 1,000 meters, penetration was marginal, and the high explosive rounds were frequently failing to detonate at all, their fuses apparently damaged by the long flight. The M2 Browning remained effective. At 1,000 meters, it was still punching through the aluminum targets and damaging structures behind them. The trajectory was flatter, the accuracy was better, the terminal ballistics were vastly superior. "One more test," Schreiber said. "Sustained fire." This was the test that mattered most to combat pilots. In a dogfight or a bomber intercept, weapons had to function continuously under stress. Stoppages were death sentences. Both weapons were loaded with maximum capacity belts. Both were fired in sustained bursts until the barrels showed signs of overheating. The results were not surprising to anyone familiar with the weapons, but they were nonetheless sobering to document officially. The MG-131 fired approximately 800 rounds before experiencing its first stoppage. The cause was determined to be a faulty primer in one of the electrically primed cartridges. The stoppage was cleared and firing resumed. 200 rounds later, a second stoppage occurred when a cartridge case failed to extract properly. By the time 1,500 rounds had been fired, the barrel was glowing, cherry red, and accuracy had degraded significantly. The M2 Browning fired continuously for over 2,000 rounds without a single malfunction. The barrel became hot enough to glow in the dim morning light, but the weapon continued to cycle perfectly. Accuracy degraded slightly due to barrel heat, but remained within acceptable parameters. When the test was finally concluded, the weapon was still functioning normally. Koch pulled off his hearing protection and approached Schreiber. "Sir, I have been testing weapons for 6 years. I have fired hundreds of different guns in controlled conditions. That American machine gun is the most reliable weapon I have ever operated. It is not elegant, it is not sophisticated, but it works absolutely every time." Schreiber made a final note on his clipboard. "Then we have our data. I will compile the report." The report took 3 days to write. Schreiber labored over every sentence, trying to present the facts without editorial comment, without interpretation that might be seen as political. He included detailed tables of penetration data, photographs of target damage, ballistic calculations showing energy delivery at various ranges. He documented the reliability testing, the endurance testing, the comparative analysis. His conclusions were carefully worded but unavoidable. Testing of the American 12.7mm machine gun against our 13mm MG-131 reveals significant differences in performance characteristics. The American weapon delivers substantially greater kinetic energy per projectile, resulting in superior penetration and structural damage at all ranges tested. The weapon demonstrates exceptional reliability in sustained fire conditions. The heavier projectile maintains velocity and energy at extended ranges more effectively than our lighter 13mm round. The MG-131 demonstrates advantages in rate of fire and weapon weight. The high-explosive incendiary ammunition provides enhanced damage potential against lightly constructed targets. However, fuse sensitivity issues result in premature detonation against layered structures, reducing effectiveness against multi-compartment aircraft. For aerial combat applications, particularly in engaging heavy bombers with multiple defensive weapons, the superior range, energy delivery, and reliability of the American design appear to provide significant tactical advantages, despite its lower rate of fire and greater weight. The report was submitted on March 16, 1944. Schreiber never learned what became of it. He suspected it was read by a few technical officers, noted, and then quietly filed away. No policy changes resulted. No new weapon development programs were initiated. The Luftwaffe continued using the MG-131, and American bombers continued to rain destruction on German cities, their 50-caliber guns still firing, still protecting their crews, still demonstrating the superiority that couldn't be officially acknowledged. But word of the test results spread through informal channels, the way such information always does in military organizations. Pilots heard about it. Ground crew heard about it. Everyone who dealt with the daily reality of aerial combat heard some version of the story. German engineers had tested the American 50 caliber against the German 13mm, and the American weapon had won decisively. For some, this confirmed what they already knew from experience. For others, it was shocking. But for almost everyone, it raised the same bitter question. If we knew our weapon was inferior, why did we continue using it? The answer, as pilots like Klaus Fischer had understood, was never purely technical. April 20th, 1944. A meeting at the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, ostensibly to discuss fighter production priorities. Present were representatives from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Air Ministry, senior Luftwaffe officers, and civilian executives from major aircraft and weapons manufacturers, including Messerschmitt, Fokker-Wulf, and Rheinmetall. The agenda included routine items, production schedules, raw material allocation, labor force management, but late in the meeting, an officer from the Technical Procurement Office raised the question that had been circulating since the Kummersdorf tests. Regarding fighter armament, he began carefully, recent field tests and combat data suggest that American defensive armament, specifically their 12.7mm weapon, provides certain performance advantages over our current standard 13mm armament. Should we consider development of an improved weapon system? The room went quiet. Everyone understood what was actually being asked. Should Germany admit that the Americans had built something better and try to copy it? The response came from a senior Air Ministry official, whose name would later be redacted from the meeting minutes. His answer was blunt. Gentlemen, we are in the 4th year of a war that spans a continent. Our factories are under constant bombardment. Our workforce is depleted. Our raw materials are increasingly constrained. We have production lines that are functioning, weapons that are adequate to their task, and ammunition stocks that match our existing firearms. You are proposing that we abandon all of this to pursue a weapon system that would require complete retooling, new ammunition production lines, modified aircraft, revised logistics chains, and months or years of development time. And for what? To copy an American design? To publicly acknowledge that enemy engineering is superior to our own? But sir, the procurement officer persisted, our pilots are reporting— I know what our pilots are reporting, the official interrupted. They are reporting that the Americans have more of everything, more planes, more ammunition, more fuel, more trained replacement crew. If we gave our pilots American 50 caliber guns, they would still be outnumbered. The problem is not the specific characteristics of individual weapons. The problem is that we are fighting an enemy with effectively unlimited industrial capacity. That may be true, said another voice, belonging to an officer identified in the minutes only as Major G, but it does not change the fact that our pilots are being killed by weapons that they cannot match. If there are technical improvements available, there are always technical improvements available, the Air Ministry official said. We could improve everything if we had unlimited time and resources, but we do not. We must prioritize. Fighter production comes first. Engine development comes second. Pilot training comes third. Weapons improvements come considerably further down the list. An executive from Rheinmetall, the manufacturer of the MG-131, spoke up. The 13mm weapon serves its purpose adequately. The high rate of fire provides suppressive capability. The explosive ammunition delivers enhanced damage per hit. Yes, the American weapon has certain advantages in raw kinetic energy, but our design has advantages in other areas. The procurement officer tried one more time. With respect, the comparative testing at Kummersdorf showed clear superiority in the American weapon across most relevant parameters. If we have documentation, proving documentation, the Air Ministry official said, does not win wars. Production wins wars. Pilots win wars. Fuel wins wars. We will continue with current armament because retooling would cost us more in time and resources than any incremental improvement in weapon performance would deliver. This discussion is closed. And it was closed. The meeting moved on to other topics. The question of adopting or developing a German equivalent to the 50 caliber was never raised again in any official capacity during the war. Years later, researchers examining captured German documents would find numerous references to the American 50 caliber in technical reports, intelligence assessments, and pilot debriefings. The weapon was clearly well known to German military planners. Its capabilities were documented. Its advantages were understood. But understanding and acting are different things, and in wartime, organizational inertia, resource constraints, and ideological considerations often override purely technical decisions. The human cost of this decision continued to mount. May 12, 1944, Hauptmann Joseph Zwernemann, flying a Fokker-Wulf 198, attacked a formation of B-24 liberators over Munich. He approached from the rear quarter, hoping to avoid the worst of the defensive fire. At 400 meters, he opened fire with his 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. He saw his rounds strike the nearest bomber, saw the impacts sparkle along the fuselage, saw sections of aluminum peel away, but the bomber continued flying, and its gunners found him almost immediately. 350 caliber machine guns engaged simultaneously, tail turret, ball turret, and right waist position. Zwerneman's fighter took hits in rapid succession. One round struck his right wing, penetrating completely and severing hydraulic lines. Another hit the armoured windscreen, starring the glass but not penetrating. A third struck his engine cowling and ricocheted into the engine itself. His Daimler-Benz engine seized within seconds. Oil pressure dropped to 0. Coolant temperature spiked. He had perhaps 1 minute of glide time before he would have to bail out, but he was over Munich, his home city. Below him were neighbourhoods he had known since childhood, streets where his family lived, buildings where he had gone to school. And somewhere down there, if they were not in the shelters, were his wife and 2 young daughters. The American bombers were heading toward those same neighbourhoods. Zwerneman made a decision. With his engine dead and his controls damaged, he could not attack again. But he could try to warn the city, to give the air raid sirens a few extra seconds. He activated his emergency radio beacon, transmitting the standard alert signal. Then he rolled the Fokker-Wulf onto its back and pulled the canopy release. The aircraft fell away below him as he tumbled through the sky. Parachute opened at 1,500 meters. He descended through smoke from previous raids, past fighters engaging bombers at higher altitudes, down toward a city that was about to be hit again. He landed in a park on the outskirts of Munich. Civilians helped him out of his parachute harness. By the time he reached a telephone to call his base, the bombs were already falling. His wife and daughters survived. Their apartment building did not. Zwerneman flew 16 more missions before the war ended. He was shot down twice more, wounded both times, but survived. After the war, when asked about his experiences, he spoke rarely about tactics or strategy. But he spoke often about the American 50 caliber. It was everywhere, he told an interviewer in 1956. Every bomber, every formation, always working, always accurate. We could shoot down individual bombers, yes, but there was no way to suppress their defensive fire, no way to approach without being engaged, no way to attack without accepting losses that we could not sustain. And our weapons? They were good weapons, excellent weapons by most measures, but they were not enough. That is the simple truth that we all knew and could not say. They were not enough. June 6th, 1944. D-Day. The Allied invasion of Normandy. While most attention focused on the beaches and the ground combat, the air war continued. American and British bombers ranged across France and Germany, attacking transportation networks, supply depots, and industrial centres. Luftwaffe fighters rose to meet them, knowing that every mission now was potentially their last. Among those fighters was Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G14 from an airfield near Paris. His target was a formation of B-17s attacking rail yards at Amiens. The interception was routine. The result was not. Weber made his attack run from above and ahead, diving through the formation at high speed. Fired all his weapons, 2 13mm machine guns and 1 30mm cannon. He saw hits. One bomber staggered, fell out of formation, and went down streaming fire. His first kill in 6 weeks. But the defensive fire found him. A 50 caliber round from a bomber he hadn't even targeted struck his canopy frame, penetrated into the cockpit, and hit his right arm just below the shoulder. The projectile nearly severed his arm. Blood sprayed across the instrument panel. Pain overwhelmed conscious thought. He dove away instinctively, his left hand pulling the stick, his right arm useless and screaming. At 3,000 meters, with vision narrowing from blood loss, he realized he was not going to make it back to base. He was not even going to make it to friendly territory. He was going down over France, and France was now filling with Allied troops. Weber managed a belly landing in a field near Cayenne. French resistance fighters found him within an hour. They could have killed him. Some argued they should. But a doctor among them, seeing the severity of his wound, chose to save his life instead. The arm was amputated at the shoulder in a farmhouse kitchen with improvised instruments and whatever pain medication the resistance had managed to acquire. Weber survived. He spent the rest of the war in a British POW camp. Years later, he told his story to historians with a stark honesty that few German veterans managed. "The American .50 caliber took my arm," he said, "but it could have taken my life. I lived because their weapon was so powerful that it partially cauterized the wound even as it destroyed my arm. If it had been a smaller caliber, I might have bled out before landing. If it had been slightly higher, it would have hit my chest and I would have died instantly." The margin between life and death was perhaps 2 centimeters. Do I resent the weapon? No. Do I resent the war that put me in a position to be shot by it? Yes. Do I resent the decisions made by people far from combat who refused to give us equipment equal to what the enemy had? Absolutely. By late 1944, such sentiments were common among Luftwaffe personnel, though rarely expressed openly. The war was clearly lost. The Americans and British controlled the skies. German fighters rose to meet them, not because victory was possible, but because defending the homeland was their duty. And every day, more German pilots learned the same lesson that Klaus Fischer and thousands of others had learned, that the deep, rhythmic sound of American .50 caliber machine guns was the sound of technological and industrial superiority, and no amount of courage could overcome it. The technical specifications told part of the story. The .50 caliber Browning delivered 12,000 to 15,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. The 13mm MG 131 delivered approximately 7,000 foot-pounds. That 75% difference in kinetic energy translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. More penetration, more structural damage, more catastrophic failures of fuel systems and control surfaces. But specifications don't capture the psychological impact. German pilots learned to fear the .50 caliber, not just because of what it could do, but because of its reliability and ubiquity. It was always there. It always worked. There was no tactical approach that avoided it, no altitude that escaped it, no weather condition that stopped it. The MG 131 was lighter, faster firing, and equipped with more sophisticated ammunition. On paper, these advantages should have mattered. In practice, they were overwhelmed by the brutal simplicity of the American approach. Heavier is better, reliability trumps sophistication, and enough quantity becomes its own quality. German engineers knew this, German pilots knew this, German commanders knew this. But the admission could never be made officially, because the admission would have required acknowledging that American industrial might, American engineering pragmatism, and American willingness to prioritize function over form had produced a fundamentally superior weapon system. And so the war continued, and German airmen continued to fly against American bombers, knowing they were outgunned, knowing that every mission was a calculated risk against odds that worsened with each passing month, knowing that the very weapon they feared most was one their own side could have matched but chose not to, for reasons that had everything to do with politics and nothing to do with protecting the lives of the men who fought. The story of the .50 caliber versus the 13mm is not a story of dramatic confrontations or decisive battles. It is a story of accumulated small advantages, of reliability under stress, of industrial capacity translated into battlefield effectiveness. It is a story that was written in the skies over Europe, one mission at a time, one engagement at a time, one dead pilot at a time. And it is a story that German veterans would carry with them long after the war ended, a story they would tell to historians and journalists and grandchildren, the story of how they fought with courage and skill against an enemy whose basic defensive weapon was better than their best offensive armament, and how that imbalance, multiplied across thousands of missions, helped decide the outcome of the air war over Europe. The technical data was undeniable. German engineers at Kummersdorf, Rechlin, and other testing facilities had examined captured American 50 caliber weapons with meticulous care. They had measured every dimension, tested every component, fired thousands of rounds under controlled conditions. The reports they produced were clinical, detailed, and impossible to misinterpret. But reports are not the same as admissions. Reports can be filed, classified, forgotten. An admission requires someone to stand up publicly and say, "We were wrong, they were right, we should have done things differently." That admission never came during the war. It couldn't come. The Nazi regime had built its legitimacy on assertions of German racial and technical superiority. To admit that American engineers had produced a superior weapon would have contradicted the foundational mythology of the state. Better to lose pilots than to lose face. The irony, of course, was that everyone involved already knew the truth. The pilots knew it from the moment they first encountered American bombers. The ground crews knew it from examining battle damage. The engineers knew it from their tests. Even the commanders knew it, though they could never acknowledge it in official channels. After the war ended, in the strange twilight period when former enemies became sources of intelligence for the emerging Cold War, American technical teams interviewed captured German personnel about their experiences and assessments of Allied equipment. These interviews, conducted at facilities like the Beaconsfield Interrogation Centre in England and various sites across occupied Germany, produced thousands of pages of testimony. The assessments of the 50 caliber Browning were remarkably consistent. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces and a senior Luftwaffe commander, was interviewed in July 1945. When asked about American defensive armament, his response was characteristically direct. The 50 caliber machine gun gave American bombers a defensive capability that we could not overcome with acceptable losses. Our pilots were brave. Our tactics were sound. But when a bomber formation could bring hundreds of heavy machine guns to bear at ranges where our own weapons were marginally effective, courage and tactics were not enough. If I could have equipped my fighters with American 50 caliber guns in place of our 13mm weapons, I would have done so without hesitation. Major Heinz Baer, another high-scoring ace, was interviewed in August 1945. His assessment focused on reliability. I flew more than 1,000 combat missions. I cannot count how many times my weapons malfunctioned at critical moments. Stoppages, feed problems, ammunition failures. These things happened to every German pilot. But American pilots, American gunners, they never seemed to have these problems. Their 50 caliber guns just kept firing. In combat, reliability is more important than any other factor. A sophisticated weapon that jams is worthless. A simple weapon that always works is priceless. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a tactical commander who survived the war despite being shot down multiple times, was interviewed in September 1945. He addressed the institutional failure. "We knew the American weapon was superior. Our intelligence reports said so. Our technical evaluations said so. Our pilots said so every time they came back from a mission. Those two came back. But to adopt the American design would have required admitting our inferiority, and that admission was politically impossible. So we continued using weapons we knew were inadequate, and we continued losing pilots we could not replace. This was not a technical failure. It was a failure of leadership and ideology. These interviews were classified at the time, and only declassified decades later. But they confirm what the historical record already suggested, that German military personnel, from pilots to engineers to commanders, understood the superiority of the American 50 caliber, and that this understanding coexisted with an institutional inability to act on that knowledge. The legacy of this strange moment in military history, when one side knew its weapon was inferior but continued using it anyway, extends far beyond World War II. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun remains in service today, more than 90 years after its initial design. It has served in every American conflict from World War II through the present day. It remains one of the most widely used heavy machine guns in the world. The MG-131, by contrast, disappeared with the Reich that produced it. Some examples survive in museums. Some were briefly used by other nations after the war, but the weapon left no lasting legacy. It was an evolutionary dead end, a design optimized for conditions that no longer existed by the time it entered service. The .50 caliber succeeded not because it was the most sophisticated weapon, but because it was the most effective. It delivered overwhelming firepower, with absolute reliability. It was simple enough to be manufactured in enormous quantities. It was robust enough to function in any environment. It was powerful enough to remain relevant even as aircraft, vehicles, and armor evolved. These qualities, reliability, manufacturability, sustained effectiveness, were American qualities. They reflected an American approach to engineering that prioritized function over elegance, that accepted weight and complexity if they delivered results, that valued something that worked every time over something that worked better but only sometimes. The German approach, exemplified by the MG-131, reflected different values: lightness, sophistication, technical cleverness. These were not bad values. In many contexts, they produced excellent results. German engineering during World War II created remarkable weapons and vehicles, but in the specific case of heavy machine guns for aerial combat, the American philosophy proved superior, and the Germans knew it. That knowledge, suppressed during the war, emerged fully in the post-war period. Former Luftwaffe personnel, freed from the constraints of Nazi ideology and official doctrine, spoke openly about their experiences. The consensus was clear. The American .50 caliber had been the better weapon, and Germany's refusal to match or adopt it had been a mistake, born of pride and ideology rather than technical reality. The human cost of that mistake was never fully calculated. How many German pilots died because their weapons were inadequate? How many missions failed because of reliability issues that American weapons didn't have? How many aircraft were lost to defensive fire that a superior offensive armament might have suppressed? These questions have no precise answers. War is too chaotic, too multifactorial, to allow such calculations. But the qualitative evidence is overwhelming. German pilots feared the American .50 caliber. They respected it. They wished they had something equivalent. And after the war, when they could speak freely, they admitted what they had known all along: that they had been asked to fight with equipment that wasn't good enough, and that their commanders had known it wasn't good enough, and that nothing had been done because the admission would have been too costly politically. This is the real story behind the title. German gunners tested captured .50 calibers and admitted the 13mm MG-131 couldn't match the power. The testing happened. The admission happened, at least informally, among the men who understood weapons and combat. What didn't happen was any meaningful action based on that knowledge. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun stands today as a monument to a particular philosophy of weapons design. Not the most elegant, not the most sophisticated, not the lightest or the fastest firing, but reliable, powerful, and effective. In the crucible of the Second World War, when it faced the German MG-131, it proved that these qualities mattered more than any amount of technical cleverness. The Germans learned this lesson the hard way. They learned it in the skies over their homeland, watching bombers survive, attacks that should have destroyed them. They learned it in after-action reports that documented weapon failures at critical moments. They learned it in testing facilities where engineers confirmed what pilots already knew. They learned it in the growing casualty lists of pilots lost to weapons their own aircraft couldn't match. And after the war, when the constraints of ideology and politics had fallen away, they admitted it, not in a single dramatic moment of recognition, but in hundreds of interviews, memoirs, and historical assessments. The admission came too late to matter for the war, but it remains on the historical record, a testament to what happens when pride and ideology override practical reality, when political considerations trump technical truth, when leaders refuse to acknowledge that the enemy might have done something better. The .50 caliber Browning didn't win the war by itself. No single weapon ever does. But it contributed to victory in ways large and small, by protecting bomber crews, by giving American forces overwhelming firepower, by forcing German fighters to accept losses they couldn't sustain. And it did all this while being a fundamentally simpler, more straightforward design than its German counterpart. That paradox that the simpler weapon proved superior is perhaps the most important lesson of this story. In engineering, in military planning, in life, sophistication is not always the answer. Sometimes, the best solution is the one that works, reliably and powerfully, every single time. The Germans understood this eventually, but understanding came too late, after too many losses, after the war was already lost. The 50 caliber Browning stands as a reminder that, in war, as in engineering, effectiveness matters more than elegance, and reliability matters more than sophistication. And sometimes, the hardest words to say are the simplest ones. We were wrong. We should have done better. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.